Welcome to Connecting Communities. I'm your host, Nancy Bacci. With me today is Georgianna Silveira, who is the Environmental Health Coordinator for the Health and Human Services Department with the City of Somerville. Welcome, Georgie.
Thanks for having me, Nancy.
Well, it's very exciting. I feel like we wanted to have you on the show to really feature you and the work that you're doing because you came on board and it was a new position and people were very excited, and there's a lot of buzz about the focus of your work at this point, which is rodents and rodent activity.
Yes,
so I'm sure everywhere you go now, people want to talk about that with you. So you started on board in January. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? And a question I'm sure you must get a lot is, how did you get interested in this sort of work? So we'll start a little bit with your background.
Yes, that is a very common question. So I studied biology at Providence College as an undergrad in Rhode Island, and I was involved in a research lab with Dr. Jonathan Richardson, and we studied urban rodent movement in cities and use of city environments, which involves some genetic work, a lot of mapping work, a lot of working with like rat data, all kinds of things, trapping, like all of that stuff. And so the position in Somerville was forwarded to our lab, and it was a great combination of kind of all of my interests, the work that I'm doing in the lab. I love working in a city environment. I think it's a really interesting kind of environment to study. And so it kind of fit all of the criteria that I was looking for and that you all were looking for. And so it was a really exciting opportunity. But yeah, I just kind of fell into the urban rat kind of world and have been involved ever since. So for about like 3 years now.
You do say that very casually, and I must say, you are the only person I know who fell into the world of urban rodent activity. So a little bit more. So, people, I think, myself included, as you know from conversations we've had, I think are naturally squeamish when it comes to the idea of rodents and what may be lurking out there. And sometimes it's better for us to just not even think that anything is lurking out there. So how did you kind of realize, like, this is what you wanted to be immersed in every day?
As you, I'm sure, are aware, concerns about rat activity, it's growing kind of across the country. Cities are receiving more and more reports of rat activity in various communities, kind of all over the country. And so it's a really exciting field to be in because there's a growing interest in it, and there's a lot of new research being done because, in previous decades, the rat movement in cities, behavior in cities was really not understood almost at all, but there's a growing number of people who do have an interest in the subject. And so it's really kind of an emerging field. And when you kind of think about a city environment, it's really a new habitat that people have created in kind of the world, something that didn't exist, and especially to this scale, like hundreds of years ago. And so it's a really interesting opportunity to learn about how animals adapt to new environments, how evolution can kind of take place in these new habitats. And everyone's favorite city animal is rats. It's they're all over the place. They're in almost every city across the world to some extent. And so it's a really a good sort of organism to study when you're thinking about how do animals behave in cities, how do they react to new city environments. And as urban communities grow and get more dense and more complex, then we're only going to have more questions to answer and more kind of patterns that we can kind of look at. So I know there was really only one professor at my school who was doing this kind of like wildlife work. And so when I started joining his lab, he did a number of projects with like frogs or mice. But it was really the rat work that kind of interested me the most because of the implications that it has. Yeah, of course.
See, that's just a funny sentence for a person to say, Georgie. It's the rat work that interests me the most.
Yeah.
And I did just want to touch upon something you said, which is really interesting, and I hadn't really thought of it in that way before, was kind of the systems approach to it, and then the historical component, which is as cities develop and change, right? Because it is interesting. I mean, I think sometimes we hear stories on the news further out in the suburbs of like people viewing coyotes and bears and, and all of these things. And then you realize like development, we're really encroaching on what has been their backyard and now becomes a person's backyard.
Yeah.
So wondering kind of the changes in development and really, I mean, as much as it pains me to say it, you almost have to admire rats in some way because of their ability to adapt to ever-evolving communities.
Yeah,
and loving them so much that they don't want to leave.
They're very good at living where humans like to live. And when you kind of look at the spread of cities across kind of different landscapes, generally you see a decrease in biodiversity because many species really aren't well suited to live in the communities that people are kind of creating. But rats are one of those animals that are super good at learning how to live in cities. There's kind of they were sort of started in Africa, but have spread across the whole world just because their behavior and their biology makes them really good at kind of exploiting the human resources that generally push other animals kind of to the fringes or just sort of out of their traditional habitats altogether.
So it's not a development we could have that would just eradicate them.
There could be,
I do like to have hope, but also realizing too, I was thinking, so you got the interest in work in school, and you started with us in January of 2019. So you've been on board for 8 months now, and wondering the different seasonal impacts, right? So you started in the winter, and because we're in the depths of summer now, so it's hard sometimes to look back. I'm like, I don't remember it being an absolutely terrible winter in terms of snow and things that we know sometimes the extreme cold seems to keep the population at bay a little bit.
Sure.
But then as we transitioned into spring and what has been a very, very warm summer with numerous days of 90 plus degrees and high humidity, I'm wondering what sort of impact that has. So if you can talk about, you started in January, wintertime. Did you see what you expected to see, I guess, based on winter?
This is a pattern that you can see in Somerville as well as in other cities that kind of track resident complaints about rat activity. And you do see usually a dip in the calls, like the lowest numbers happening around January, February, and then the numbers kind of increase almost exponentially through the summer with the peaks in sort of July, August. So we're kind of in the height of rat season right now. And then those numbers again kind of fall off as temperatures do begin to sort of decrease and people are outside less. And, one of the challenges that comes with, urban rat population management is that currently really the only way that the city has to learn more about rats, to know where they are, to understand their activity levels is through resident reports to the 311 line. And so, we do see a spike in calls in July and August, but it's not really known whether that means that the rat population is bigger or are people just sort of encountering rats more because both rats and people are out more in August. Yeah, whereas in January, all the rats are underground and all the people are inside. So you don't have anyone seeing a rat, so no one's going to call about them. And so that's part of the reason that, again, this is an exciting field to be in because there are so many unknown questions. And so just sort of answering things like that are all the rats dying off in winter, or are they just kind of hiding in their holes and sleeping, part of the theory of why cities do seem to be experiencing higher rat populations is, winters are becoming more mild across the country, which allows more of the rat offspring to survive sort of through that winter. And so, global climate change is something that has implications that we don't even know yet. And one of the theories is that it might be impacting rat populations. But again, the fact that Somerville and, all cities across the country kind of are only relying on residents who sort of take the initiative to report is a field that's kind of lacking, it's an aspect that's kind of lacking to rodent management in many cities. And so trying to develop better ways to monitor and measure and track where rats are and why is a really important part of managing these populations and something that I'm kind of trying to work with Somerville and with other city departments on sort of to deal with this problem.
It's very interesting because, as you said, I know the mayor, city staff, residents are always encouraging each other. Just if you call, report it. If you see it 3 days in a row, call 3 days in a row. And sometimes I think we just kind of internalize things like it's part of city living, right? But it's a quality of life issue, and I think it's really important for people to say, I saw one Monday night, so I called, and I saw it, on Wednesday. It was just to really, because it does help to identify the hot spots. And I know in a minute or two, we're going to see some graphics of different things to, track some of the data. And I do think it is important, as you noted, to realize it is one of the really few things that rely on people taking the initiative to report because, if you're not getting calls, then you're not looking at an area. So it is kind of, challenging because you really want people to take ownership of the space, because, you know, we're all in this together to make the city a great place, and realizing like you need to make the call, and you need to, you know, since you've been on place, I know we've had people stop by the office and just really, you know, but it's great to have that. And I think it really provides a sense of ease to people, realizing there is someone who, you know, the majority of your work is focusing on learning all about this. And it really, as much as I told you, you know, it makes me a little, it is a really interesting thing when you think of all the variables that have to be in place in order for a population of rodents to survive and thrive in a city. And then what does that mean in terms of impact on other communities, you know? I think sometimes we like to think with things that here are the very clear city lines, and it just go any further, and realizing that the rodents don't seem to respect the fact that they've crossed the street and maybe somewhere else. So just really looking at all of those things. I mean, you know, I've been fortunate to have very many conversations with you about different parts of your work, and just really realizing like the enthusiasm you bring to it, I think is really critical, because it is such an unwieldy, uncomfortable topic, honestly. You know, I think sometimes people feel hesitant to report because they don't want people to be like, my area of the city isn't clean, not realizing like the length that rats can travel, and other exciting things you're going to tell us about in a few moments.
Oh, sure.
I did want to talk initially, before we look at some of the graphics, about the rat survey and the work with the contractors. Can you kind of set the stage as to what that pilot project looked like?
Yeah, sure. So as I had kind of mentioned before, the only way that the city kind of knows where rats are is based on these 311 reports. And because I come from kind of a research background, something that I really wanted to start doing once I kind of got settled here in Somerville was do some kind of measurement, some kind of like hard quantitative measurement of where rats are kind of in an area of the city. And so what we did from sort of starting in the end of April to mid-May was we worked with a contractor that sort of like the city hired, and I kind of helped them do the study design and everything. But what we did was we actually set out, you know, those traditional kind of snap trap, kill traps on private properties with permission from the owners. We set traps on private properties in East Somerville, kind of that area between Broadway and Washington, like through that whole area, stopping at basically at McGrath. So just like a whole sort of continuous section of the city. We set out almost 300 rat traps at 134 properties, I believe, for about 3 weeks. And we just trapped rats, counted how many there were. The contractors threw them out, so I didn't have to touch them, which was awesome. And we sort of used that as a measurement of activity. And then I kind of took all of that data back to my office, and I compared it to various environmental features. You know, we looked at trash ticketing, we looked at construction locations, we looked at 311 calls to see if, you know, on a block level scale, are the calls that we're receiving, did they reflect the rat activity that I measured, and kind of things like that. So trying to kind of develop a system where we don't have to just put the responsibility on the residents to measure this, where the city can kind of take a more active role in determining where these rats are and what they're kind of doing. And so it was really exciting. We had, you know, great participation. I didn't knock on doors or anything. Like, people just kind of got a letter and were really willing to participate in this, you know, give us permission to go onto the property, ask questions to me about what are you doing, why, what have you learned. You know, people have been really engaged kind of in what we've been doing with this and what we've learned, which was really exciting. And we got some good data about what kind of environmental factors are strongly associated with rat activity. And so I don't know if you want me to talk about the results a little bit, or...
Sure, if you want to do that, and then we'll start looking at some of the images, and you can talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, sure. So the kind of biggest thing that we learned was that food storage locations were kind of the most strongly associated with patterns of higher rat activity.
Does that mean trash, Georgie?
Yes. Yeah, sorry, trash storage locations, which provide a food source. And so specifically, we found higher rat activity around dumpsters, city trash receptacles, and residential properties that received 2 or more citations for violating city trash ordinances kind of since the beginning of the year. And these ordinances are things like, you know, storing trash in bags on the ground or leaving barrels open, kind of things like that contribute to improper trash storage that make it then vulnerable to rat feeding. And so, you know, popular understanding of rat behavior is that the food source is the most important determinants of whether or not rats will set up shop in an area and kind of live there. And so it was kind of unsurprising, but still interesting that we found such a high association around these areas. And what I thought was really interesting was that if a property just had one trash violation, we really didn't see any increase, but it was 2 or more violations. So it's kind of consistent improper storage that's really leading to these patterns of high activity that we're seeing. And so part of the new next steps that we're going to do based on this information is, try to roll out some more education, make sure that that education is consistent for people who, are renting in the city, moving around a lot, making sure that, everyone living in the city has the information available for what are the best practices for trash storage so that you're not attracting rats kind of to your property and to your neighborhood. And so I think that was like kind of the most interesting result that we found, and that's given me the most direction into where we need to kind of target our educational efforts and outreach through the city.
I know you mentioned food source, and a little bit we are going to talk a little bit more about the other factors that make or create a welcome environment for rats, so we'll look at that. But I was hoping we could go through the graphics and you're able to just chat a little bit about what we're seeing. Do you want to take a look?
Sure.
All right, let's take a look.
So here you have just a couple of maps that I produced, and these are based on the through and one calls that the city has received. I mapped them kind of heat map style, so you can see the areas that have the most calls. Darker colors means, more calls kind of in that area. And from 2016 to 2019, you can see a pretty consistent pattern where most of the calls we receive are concentrated in East Somerville and kind of Ward 2, which, makes sense because these are, rats kind of stay in a pretty contained area. They don't go super far away from their burrow or anything. And so we're really seeing this kind of consistent pattern across the city. And so what my work is kind of focused on is figuring out why these areas have these kind of hot spots of calls. People are seeing rats, encountering rats more often, theoretically. And so kind of figuring out what we can do kind of in these areas to address that. And I think these patterns are really interesting, and this is kind of why we targeted East Somerville for the trapping survey, because
makes sense when you look at that. It is interesting when you kind of see the whole city laid out that way and then realize it's always interesting. I will say I always look at these and I try to identify like where in the city I live
of course,
what it is. I think everybody wants to know. But it is really interesting when you kind of see like concentrated areas and things like that. And like you said, learning all of these other variables to it is really very interesting.
Yeah. And habitat management is always the most important, is always the best strategy for long-term rat management because, lethal strategies will only work in the short term. And if everything else in the environment remains the same and you kill every single rat in the area, other ones are going to move right in and eat the same food and live in the same burrows.
I feel like they have a network and potentially share information.
Oh yeah, it's rat Twitter.
Oh, I didn't think of that. There you go. We'll look at the next one. Great.
And so this is a super exciting map. This was based on the trapping survey that I had mentioned previously. And so we, similar to kind of what was done with the hotspots, but instead...
Tell us the color scheme, I'm sorry.
Oh yes, so you see areas of red and areas of blue, and the red areas we measured higher relative rat activity kind of based on the trapping data that we collected. And then the blue areas are hotspots of low activity, and the really dark blue areas are places where we didn't catch any.
Okay.
And the program that I did, it took the kind of known points of rat activity that we measured, and it used some fancy math to guess across the area based on the known points we have. What is the likely rat activity in kind of the other areas? So this is like an estimation of rat activity sort of across the area, and you can kind of see in the top left corner, there was a couple areas where it's like mostly red, but some blue areas. You can see that we caught rats at a lot of properties in this area, but not every property, but the program is still showing this as an area of high activity based on these numbers that we kind of collected. And so this was like the main result from the trapping survey and like the sort of final graphic based on like what we kind of found. But this is like a measurement of rat activity based on the trapping numbers that we actually caught. And so you see Broadway at the top there, Washington's on the bottom. That's kind of the area that we looked at.
Very interesting. And here are some examples of burrow holes.
Yes, and so something super important that you can do if you're kind of concerned about rat activity in your area is just kind of keep an eye out on your own property, especially if you rent in the city. I think, I know I personally, I rent and I don't go out into the yard almost at all. And so just kind of making sure that if you live in the city, you're kind of keeping an eye out on your own property, on city property, things like that for where rats may be living, because we don't know if there's, we can't do anything about a problem if we don't know it's there. And so the most important thing is always just keep an eye out for rat activity. And so these are a couple examples of rat burrow holes. The species of rat that we have in Somerville lives in burrows that it kind of digs in the ground. The holes are generally 2 to 3 inches wide. And if they're active, they tend to be kind of smooth at the edges because the rats are going in and out of them. And so these are some pictures of burrow holes that I collected across the city. Sometimes they can get into sidewalks. And so those were kind of, you can see my shoes in those pictures. And
well,
then,
that's actually what I was going to ask you. So it's interesting because the ones that clearly were in the dirt, the rats have created, and then it seems otherwise they're just kind of utilizing existing spaces and turning them into their homes.
It's tough in cities like Somerville that have pretty old buildings and pretty old infrastructure, because rats actually, they have really strong teeth and can chew through like materials that we would think would be pretty hard, like the mortar between bricks. They can eventually kind of chew through those and make a hole for themselves. And so, you know, as sort of city infrastructure ages, it's more important than ever to make sure that things are updated and people are kind of keeping an eye on sidewalk holes like this, or you know, holes that they're kind of seeing in their own properties. And rats can fit through a hole that's about the size of a quarter or half an inch.
That is terrifying.
Yep, and so making sure that any kind of holes or vulnerabilities in a foundation or around utility lines that go into a building from the outside, making sure that everything is kind of sealed up and protected is very important. And this is an evidence of rat chewing on a city barrel that I noticed. I snapped a little pic of it, and so, you know, we try our best to keep barrels sort of secure against rat entry with covers and by using hard plastic barrels. But again, rats have very strong teeth, and they have to keep chewing all the time because their teeth grow continuously like bunnies. And so unfortunately, we do see across the city, you know, resident barrels getting chewed through, and barrels like this kind of getting chewed through on the bottom. And so it's important to be sure that food trash is stored in barrels for as short of a time as possible. So put it out in the barrel as close to pickup as you can, and make sure the barrels are washed and always covered and things like that to make sure that they aren't, they don't, you know, smell like food trash and are vulnerable to activity like this.
It's very interesting. Oh, and there we are.
And here is the rat. These are the kinds of rats that we have in cities. They're called Rattus norvegicus, also called Norway rats, brown rats, sewer rats. They have lots of names. There's really only one species of rat in cities in North America, especially here where we have kind of colder winters. They're good at kind of surviving the cold and things like that, and they're burrowers. You know, you'll find them on the ground. They don't like to be in houses necessarily, but if they encounter a basement and they can get in, they will try to get in. It's a warm place to hide. And so just always making sure that you're keeping an eye on the ground, keeping an eye on any holes or cracks that might develop, and sealing those up whenever possible.
That's great. Thank you. So that was a lot. So I guess what I wanted to note, you had mentioned earlier about a food source. What are the other things that would make a space attractive to rats? What are the components?
I would always say food source is the most important, and so besides trash, ensuring that you know, feeding the birds, any bird seed or bread that's left on the ground is also going to be a food source to rats. It's also important to make sure, keep an eye on vegetable gardens. If you have any plants like that, keep an eye on whether or not rats may be eating those as well, because that's a common food source in the city. Compost bins, making sure that those are either elevated off the ground or sort of secured against rat entry through other kind of methods, and any pet food that might be left out. Rats love that.
And we hear water as well, if there's a water source for them.
Oh, sure, yeah. So rats are kind of different from mice in that rats actually do need to drink water to survive, and so overturned barrels that might sort of collect pools
Oh,
of water
yes.
in them. Could be a water resource for them, as well as like old tires, bird baths, anything that kind of can collect water in a puddle. It's important to kind of make sure that those are dumped out and not sort of available to rats. And also that will help with mosquitoes, because mosquitoes lay their eggs kind of in standing water. And so just kind of being aware of any sort of water sources as well, because they do need food and water to kind of make their home. And then in terms of a good burrowing location, rats love exposed soil. And so it's very important to ensure that any sort of plants or vegetation in a yard, be sure that they're trimmed kind of in a V shape so that you can always see the ground underneath, because they always want to hide their burrows. They don't want it just to be like in the middle of anywhere where a human or a hawk or someone can kind of catch them. And so they'll be always hiding them under sheds or under plants or things like that. And so just always making sure that when you have plants in a yard that you can see the ground visibly, that will kind of deter them from burrowing in the area.
Oh, that's important. I don't think that I've ever heard that
Yeah.
information about that too. And you know, as we see more and more people using outdoor space, and you know, people want to beautify their area, so I think that's important to share as well. So if people are seeing rodents, what should they do, Georgie?
We always ask people to please call 311 so that I know and so that the city knows that you know, your area is having a problem, and we know where to kind of direct our resources. If you can identify the food source, that's going to be the best way to try to get rid of them. You know, if you can figure out what they're eating in the area and remove it, they won't stay in the area. As well as trying to look into any sort of exclusion sort of techniques, and you know, the city has resources about ways to sort of prevent rat activity, how to spot rat activity, and that webpage is somervillema.gov/rodent control. So if you have questions about what you can do to prevent rat activity, or what to do if you see rat activity and you're looking to kind of do those type of exclusion techniques, then the city does have resources about the best ways to kind of go about that. If you're looking into extermination services, the best sort of buzzword to look for is integrated pest management, or IPM, which involves the sort of coordinated use of as many pest control techniques as are available.
I like that idea. Throw as much at it as humanly possible.
Yeah, and every method isn't going to be effective in every situation. And so a contractor that's going to use integrated pest management will sort of develop a plan that's going to work best for your property and your environment. Sort of having a service that like looks in that is going to use that method is going to be the most effective.
That's great.
And if
so, thank you so much. That was a lot of information. I think is great for people. So if people are looking to follow up, as you said, they can call 311 to report. They can connect with you through the city's main number, stop by the office and see you.
Yes.
I think that people have been excited. I know you had a public meeting about it, so there certainly has been a lot of ways of sharing the information. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. As always, I'd like to thank the production crew, Joe Constantine and Ben Martin. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next month.